Well, hey, welcome to this session on vocal theory. We're excited to talk about some music theory things today that sort of encapsulate the way that we sing. And particularly, there's two kinds of ways that we talk about vocal parts. And today we're really going to talk about harmony a lot, because I think that's where theory in singing really gets applied when we're trying to put different parts together to form a vocal chord. And so there's a couple of ways that you're going to hear us communicate this. Maybe you grew up in choir, or maybe you grew up with a singing background from school or from church choir or something like that, and you're used to the terms like tenor, alto, soprano, baritone. You're used to the more formal terminology when it comes to talking about vocal parts. And sometimes we will communicate in those parts. That's one of the two ways that we talk about vocal parts. So if you grew up, you're familiar with that, fantastic. A lot of the songs that we lead in modern worship, if they're male-led, they're led in the tenor range. And so typically we have an alto on top of that with the next harmony up, or we have a soprano above that. Rarely so. What we try to do with parts is keep them as close to the melody as possible, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So sometimes we'll communicate in this tenor, alto, soprano with the tenor being the melody. We'll also communicate tenor, alto, soprano with the alto being the melody. On female-led songs, a lot of times the alto is the melody and the soprano part will be just above it and the tenor part will be just below it. What you won't hear a lot of in modern pop music, or especially modern worship music, is a baritone part. Every once in a while, we'll use the octave of the melody lower for a male if it's a female-led song, or we'll use the octave of the melody above on a female part if it's a male-led song. But for the most part, as we're making chords and singing harmony together, when we use that tenor, alto, soprano language, we're talking about the parts closest to the melody. And I'll explain that as we talk about the second way that we communicate how we talk about vocal parts, and that's through the number system. And I really encourage you to watch the basic music theory unit in the meta curriculum, because I'm going to use some language that is really more music theory language, and so maybe as a vocalist you're not as familiar with music theory. So I encourage you, go watch that session or that unit if you haven't already, and just make sure that you familiarize yourself with the basic terminology around the number system in music theory. So here's what that looks like. The melody we kind of refer to as the 0 point. And if you have ever heard The Sound of Music, or maybe you just know this from training in the past, but do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do is the 8-note sort of major scale that we refer to in the number system. And so if the melody is the first note, then do, re, mi is the third note, fa, so is the fifth note in the scale. And so we'll refer to those parts as thirds and fifths. And if you remember from the basic music theory unit, that's how we make a major chord. We have the melody, the tonic note, the root note, then we have the third interval and the fifth interval, and that makes a major chord. Now we'll move those notes around as we harmonize together and make parts interesting, but sometimes as we're singing melody, we'll refer to a part as the third, which is that third interval, or the fifth, which is that interval here. Sometimes we'll even say, hey, sing the fifth, which is the part above, but we want it to be the octave below. And so we'll communicate in these numbers sometimes, and based on whether a song is male-led or female-led, we always try to keep these parts, again, as close to the melody as possible. And so whether we're talking about tenor, alto, soprano, or whether we're using the number system to delineate and communicate those parts, the goal for us is to produce vocal parts that really encourage the church to sing. And so we want to make sure that there are parts that are close to the melody, and that there are parts there in every vocal range so that men and women alike can contribute, can engage, and worship together as the church. And so I encourage you to go back to that basic music theory unit, make sure that you understand the foundations of basic music theory, and hopefully this has been helpful to you today to understand how we communicate that theory as vocalists.